My name is Joye. I'm Director of Heritage at Dublin Port, and in a previous life I was also a curator at the National Museum of Ireland, where we did a lot of work on the weapons of the War of Independence. Academic historians and even amateur historians have a very poor grasp of what weapons can and cannot do. In a good way, Ireland has a very little understanding of weapons. We don't have a gun culture. We have very strict gun laws. So many historians, when they come to write books, give weapons almost mystical powers of what they can and cannot do. So what I want to do today is kind of tackle those myths, look at the weapons of the IRA, but also of the Crown Forces during the period. And also, from my new role as Director of Heritage at Dublin Port, look at smuggling into Ireland between 1916 and 1921. This follows on from a talk I gave last year on duelling in Ireland in the 18th century, when Irish gentlemen, both Roman Catholic and Protestant, really liked to shoot each other quite a lot. So we're now looking at the 20th century. So as I said, we'll look after the weapons of Ireland prior to 1916 rising, and some of the research that came out of that, weapons of the Crown Forces, and then weapons of the IRA, followed by smuggling guns, and then a conclusion. And I hope to get you all out of here within about 35 to 40 minutes. Implicit in this, if you are planning your own revolution, there are hints and techniques that you might want to take away from my talk, which will help you for your own revolution if you're planning one in the 21st century, learning from the mistakes of others. So the War of Independence from January 1919 to 21 remained essentially a guerrilla war that was to follow throughout the 20th century. In many ways, the Irish experience was the beginning of that. It was one of the few to succeed. Only 25% of wars of independence in the 20th century actually succeeded. Your chances of going up against a big government power, a big imperial power, or going up against even a small government and succeeding as a guerrilla force are actually quite small. So it is quite an achievement even to get the other side to go to the peace table. It cost the British government £20 million a year and caused just over 2,000 casualties. And as Union was explaining earlier on, compared to other wars of independence or civil wars during this period, it's actually quite a small number. There were no attacks with planes or artillery, although planes are used for reconnaissance, and tanks are used, but mainly as a psychological weapon to intimidate large crowds, which I'll talk about later on. And therefore, the weapons of the War of Independence are very much those that people can carry, the weapons of the participants. And this is different from what's happened over the previous 4 years between 1914 and 1918, because at that period, of course, all the weapons that are being used in World War I are getting larger, more destructive, and causing more and more damage. And many weapons, in many cases, the weapons of the soldiers play no role in the latter part of World War I. It's the artillery, really, that causes the big destruction, and the machine guns. So for the IRA, the lack of weapons was always a major concern for them. If you read the accounts on the Bureau papers, very much their main concern is the lack of weapons. And, of course, it does impact on what they can and cannot do. This is kind of the essence of what I'm going to talk about. When we look at the War of Independence, it doesn't happen just suddenly. It does take a while to pick up. From 1918 to 1919, most historians will see this as a small-scale attacks on the police, with destruction of minor outposts and sporadic assassinations throughout the year. Then it gets faster, and the tempo gets faster in January 1920 to October, especially with the arrival of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, as the police force, due to resignations, is becoming smaller and smaller, and the British insist on maintaining that this is very much a policing operation. And it's into the final period that really you see a huge amount of violence, and the establishment of active service units or flying columns is the response from the IRA. And in this final period, no one can say they're definitely winning. Both sides are just carrying out more and more attacks. Some are succeeding, some are not succeeding. But it does become the most violent period in that kind of 9-month period. For civilians, the casualty rates for civilians in this last period is 64%. So on both sides, with the IRA and the Crown Forces, it's actually the civilians that are getting killed. And in that 9-month period, 70 civilians are killed by the Crown Forces purely for failing to stop when told to halt. So on an open street in Dublin, if you're told to stop by a policeman carrying a large gun, your instinctive role might be to run away, and his instinctive role is to shoot you. And at that final phase, 70 civilians alone are killed due to the fact that they didn't stop. So prior to the War of Independence, the big moment before the 1916 rising is the arrival of the Asgard ship in Howth Harbour in the summer of 1914, with these weapons here, which are famously become known as the Hoth rifle, or the Moser Mark I rifle, which is a single-shot weapon, which was smuggled in, 900 of them on this yacht that belonged to Molly and Erskine Childers. It was a big, amazing adventure for him to bring, for both of them to bring the weapons into Ireland on time, unload them onto the pier. And Erskine Childers, a master of PR, made sure that every part of it was photographed so that everyone would know about the success that they had. You have Mary Spring Rice and Molly Childers on the ship here. Naturally, a few weeks earlier, or a few months earlier, the UVF had landed almost 20 tons of ammunition in Larne. So this is a very smaller operation with 900 rifles, but Childers understood the power of the photographs and it was about being seen to do something in Dublin. The volunteers who met him came onto the pier, many of them carrying wooden batons. And then they march off very, very quickly, and they're starting to look like soldiers. And for Padraig Pearse, as you can see the quote there, he realized that these were antiquated weapons. They were, at this stage, 50 years old. There was a reason why they were bought cheaply on the international market by the Darrell Figgis. They were available and cheap. They were single shot. The most you can do is fire about 4 rounds a minute out of them, and they're not as effective as what the British Army would have had at the stage. And Figgis himself kind of highlights the fact they were ideal for the purpose. They were cheap and undeniably effective, but quite slow to use. We were lucky in 2014 that we had an opportunity to take some of the weapons from the National Museum's collections and bring them onto a firing range and actually carry out ballistic testing to see how effective these weapons are. So the weapons that we brought included Vickers machine guns, but also the Hoth rifle itself, and also a weapon I'll be talking about later on, which is the Peter the Painter, or the Moser automatic pistol. So that was become the main weapon for the volunteers during the 1916 Rising. For the officers, though, in this case, the Padraig Pearse, there was a fascination with going off and buying your own weapons. At the time, you could normally go down to a hunting shop, a game shop in Dublin, and buy one of these weapons, which is the Peter, the Moser 1896 pistol, which was a semi-automatic pistol. So you start to see a pecking order within the volunteers very, very quickly. Those who could afford to have a tailor make their own uniform and also buy the equipment naturally become the officers, while those who are reliant on the shipment from the Asgard become the volunteers. So nearly all the leaders of the 1916 Rising carried this particular gun. It becomes known in Ireland as the Peter the Painter pistol. And no other country does that happen. It's named after a siege in London in 1910 called the Sydney Street siege, when an anarchist called Peter used one of these weapons and held the Metropolitan Police at bay for over 24 hours, and eventually the British Army had to be sent in to capture and kill him. So in Ireland, for some reason, we call it the Peter the Painter. We'll talk about it later on because it plays a very important role during the 1916 Rising. As well as rifles and pistols like this, the volunteers went into the 1916 Rising with pikes, so carrying on a tradition that we see from 1798. In this case, this pike was one of 5 pikes that were used during the attack on Dublin Castle. So again, it reflects the crying need for weapons that the volunteers of 1916 and later on the IRA had. You're an island, it's very hard to get these things in. So a pike was used in a number of the battles throughout the 1916 Rising. On the bottom one you can see, or maybe just see, it says, left behind by rebels in the Upper Castle Yard, 1916. And as I say, it kind of shows you the desperate nature of supplying them during the Rising. This here is the remains of a garden shear, which has been turned into a shotgun bayonet. Again, shotguns play a big role in the War of Independence. And by putting this on, you're able to turn your shotgun, again, into a small pike. And during the Rising, of course, the British quickly introduced artillery, and the rebels really had no response to the artillery. And it's the artillery that really changes things from the Tuesday of the Rising. Coming back to the Peter the Painter pistol, it plays a key role in 1916 during the Mount Street battles. This is number 29, Northumberland Road, where Lieutenant Malone, with one of those pistols, was able to hold up the Sherwood Foresters for almost 12 hours. It's one of the weapons that we tested in 2014, and A small pistol is normally only has a distance of about 20 meters. You don't expect that much from a pistol. But when we fired this particular weapon, we were able to shoot out to 150 meters and also to get body shots at 150 meters, which is unheard of for a small weapon like that. And we started to see and understand the Mount Street battle in a different way and the importance of these pistols in built-up areas. And this is a map that kind of shows you the movement of the Sherwood Foresters following the red dots up towards Mount Street Bridge across the Grand Canal. And the areas of blue are the areas that the 18 volunteers were based in. The first position is here, is where Northumberland House, number 29, Lieutenant Malone was. You then had a further group in the Parochial Hall, and then Clanwilliam House at the end. And again, if you're planning your own revolution, this is how you organise an ambush. This is called defence in depth. So the Sherwood Foresters are held up here for almost 12 hours. Then they move on. They're feeling sorry for themselves. They can see that the enemy are up here in Clanwilliam House because they're being shot at. When they get shot from the side, and that carries more casualties. In the end, 84 Sherwood Foresters became casualties, were either killed or wounded. And 1,000 Sherwood Foresters, well over a battalion, were held up for 24 hours by 18 volunteers. So from the IRA point of view, it's a volunteer point of view, it's one of the few successes of a 1916 Rising. But it kind of shows you what you can do in built-up areas with well-sighted ambush sites and weapons like the Peter the Painter, which again does play a role during the War of Independence. So looking at the Crown forces in the War of Independence, the Royal Irish Castabri have been around since 1822. Got the title Royal in 1867 in honour of their contribution putting down the Fenian Rising of 1867. It's a mixed force, 70% Roman Catholic but 30% Protestant, and then again more Protestant in the officer corps that had slightly changed towards the time of the War of Independence. 85,000 members in the 100-year period of its existence. And Limerick, for some interesting reason, had the highest density of police presence in Ireland. Kind of assumptions that we can make is that it was mainly due to various land wars that occurred during the later part of the 19th century. So it's not Cork, so I apologise for that. It's Limerick. So Limerick City had 13 separate stations and Limerick County 47 stations. The force was mobile. The introduction of Pikes at the turn of the century allowed them to become a very mobile force. They were equipped, unlike police in England, with weapons, in this case carbines, which are handy to carry on the bicycles. And this would be an average station with a sergeant and the men in his station. And each one of them, as you can see, is carrying weapons. The carbine is this type of weapon up here. It's a shortened version of the standard British Army weapon, which is the Lee Enfield Rifle. And as I said, it was easier to carry on the bike, and that's why they had those. They're also equipped with revolvers. The Webley revolver has a chamber that takes 6 rounds. It fires a 45 round. It's a very, very effective weapon, and I'll talk about that later on. And they were also equipped with pump-action shotguns. This is the 1897 Winchester shotgun, which has a shortened barrel, and that's what makes it different from a normal shotgun. If you're in a riot situation, you don't want somebody grabbing the barrel of your gun, so that's why you have a shortened barrel. And this weapon is still used today in a lot of police forces in America. It just looks smaller and lighter. Of course, with the introduction of the Black and Tans and later on the auxiliaries, they become more of a militarised force. And this is a picture of the British auxiliaries in 1921. In this case, they haven't fully transitioned into their auxiliary police uniforms. And you can see very heavy use of military-style uniforms. And you can see also their medal ribbons showing their service during the war. And this is what we would associate as more type of uniform that the auxiliaries were wearing by the time of 1921. The Dublin Metropolitan Police is a smaller force. It has about 1,200 members. It's based in 24 stations and 7 divisions, A to G. It's very much based on the London Metropolitan Police, and it's unarmed, which is a big difference between that and the RIC, which was always an armed force. In 1916, after the Rising, they are given weapons, and there's a small mutiny among the policemen themselves. They don't want to have weapons or be seen to become targets carrying weapons. However, you had the G Division, otherwise known as the G-men. They were always equipped with pistols, and later on, by 1920, due to a large number of attacks by the squad, and Michael Collins' squad on them, they started to carry automatic weapons, the Webley and Scott 1911 automatic pistol, because, as I say, a large number of attacks on them. The G Division, or the G-men, is a term that is carried by many irregular or anti-treaty forces when they go to America after the Civil War. And it's a term that's applied to the FBI, and that's where the term is now used in America, and that's where the transition is from. So G-men is a term used in Dublin, and by the end of the 1920s, it's a term that's been used in New York and in Chicago. And this is the small automatic pistol the G-men would have been carried. However, by the end of 1920, Michael Collins and the squads had effectively nullified this force as a resource within Dublin. The British Army had, by the end of the War of Independence, 60,000 soldiers in Ireland. And after the proclamation of martial law at the end of 1920, had taken a more aggressive role in Ireland. The image that you see on the right-hand side there is a standard British Army battalion, which consists of 800 soldiers in 4 companies, A, B, C, and D. So a very effective fighting force. In Ireland at the time, you would have had the 5th Division based in the Curragh camp, and then in Cork, you would have had the 6th Division. By 1921, you also would have had the 1st Division. With the creation of Northern Ireland and the 6 counties, they ended up with their own division up there. The British Labour Party did a report in December 1920 on Ireland and the state of Ireland. It's a very interesting document as a contemporary document. And they say that discipline within this force by the end of 1920 is starting to collapse and has become very, very lax. And they also have some very choice words to say about the auxiliaries. When it comes to the equipment of the Army, the British Army at this stage, they were equipped for full-scale army. This image here kind of gives you an idea of steel helmets, machine guns, and rifles. The standard rifle, as I mentioned earlier on, is the Lee Enfield Rifle. Normally, a British Army soldier would have been sent out into Dublin with 150 bullets. The rifle is very, very effective at 500 metres. And normally, compared with the Hoth rifle, you'll normally get 15 rounds out of the rifle, aimed shots, in 1 minute. So that means in a normal ambush situation, your 150 bullets aren't going to last longer than 10 minutes. However, the IRA on the other side, in many cases, only had ammunition for an ambush of maybe 2 to 3 minutes when they started firing. And on many occasions, you'll also find Lewis machine gun on the trucks and being carried by the troops. And by the time of the British getting fully involved, British Army getting fully involved in the War of Independence, you have 2 Lewis machine guns to every 40 soldiers. So in many of the ambushes of the 1921, the IRA are finding themselves very, very substantially outgunned by just the average British Army soldier. And of course, this does impact on IRA ambushes. They do really rely on surprise, and particularly carrying out attacks at night when that gave them some chance of surprising the British Army. In 1921, the British Army are seeing more on the city of Dublin. They're involved in spot checks. They're carrying out mobile patrols. They're taking over a series of buildings in the city centre. In this case here, just outside the Dole, you can see a truck with a searchlight on it. And this, again, was to break the IRA at night. By bringing their own searchlights in, it allowed the British Army to dominate the night and take away that sense of surprise. So a searchlight is also accompanied by 2 armoured cars. And again, more and more armoured cars are being brought into Ireland in 1921 as the ante gets up. And then more armoured cars, and then the use of tanks, as I mentioned earlier on. In this case, in April 1920, 2 tanks are brought to Mount Joye jail to disperse crowds. Again, a tank in a modern urban environment isn't going to really work. They're quite slow. But to intimidate the crowds, they were brought out from 1920 on. And the tanks were kept in the Royal Barracks, now called Collins Barracks, where the National Museum is. So for the IRA at this time, the IRA is actually a very small organisation between 1919 and 21. Michael Collins estimated of an active group of about 3,000 active members. However, you do require a larger number of people to support you, to provide safe houses, to move weapons around the cities. But it's 3,000 active members. When we look at the pension records, which are now freely available, as Ewan mentioned earlier on, the Military Archives website, we know just short of 18,000 people received a pension. However, we also know that 83,000 people applied for the pension, but for a variety of reasons didn't get it. Now, we can have a slight element of cynicism towards that, but the other thing is you also have to look at a cash-strapped society or state that really couldn't afford to give out pensions, and hence why it was a very torturous process to get your pension, and it wasn't going to be handed over too easily. And you can see that in the pension files, which, as Union said, are a fascinating insight into what people did. J.P. Duggan was a historian in the 1980s who wrote a book about the Irish Army, and in many ways he kind of summarises the situation for the IRA during this time. Without standard weaponry, collective training and concentration of force, it was unlikely that guerrilla warfare, no matter how skillfully waged, could achieve military victory. And I was talking to Union earlier on, this is a problem for the IRA because, again, because in Ireland there isn't a tradition of having weapons, maybe on a farm or having a shotgun, you do have a very high casualty rate among IRA men shooting themselves. Revolvers in particular are notorious, and pistols. They have accidents. They're very small. It's very easy to take a pistol and turn it around and accidentally shoot yourself or somebody beside you. Rifles, as a rule of thumb, are a lot easier, more practical and safer to use. So again, it's the lack of training for many of the IRA men is a big problem. And the standard weaponry is an issue because, as I'll talk about later on, in many ambushes, you have volunteers going in, and each one of them has a different type of weapon with different types of ammunition. And that's why the British Army had an advantage. They had one type of rifle, one type of bullet, which could also be used in the machine guns, which made life a hell of a lot easier. This is sort of an idealized, romanticized view of what a flying column would have looked like. It's taken during the truce, the period after the latter part of 1921. Everyone in the Mayo flying column here has a rifle, but the reality is, as I said, most units had a mismatch of weapons. Ernie O'Malley, in writing in Another Man's Wounds, describes in South Tipperary the variety of weapons that he came across for one quartermaster. So a variety of different types of weapons. The British long and short Lee Enfields and police carbines all sound like they're the same, but they all have different bullets, which led to problems where the wrong ammunition was handed out during ambushes in South Tipperary. But then you have a variety of weapons all the way back to muzzle-loading Queen Anne's, which would be well over 300 years at that stage. So it does show you the problem that the IRA had. Vinnie Byrne also carried a Peter the Painter as a member of the squad during the War of Independence. He was using this weapon to carry out assassinations in Dublin. As I said, this weapon is effective out to 150 metres, so you can only imagine when he was using it up close that the damage would cause. And again, on the Military Archives website, you can see a series of interviews with him describing how he used this particular weapon, which is very gruesome listening. This is the most common way for weapons to be smuggled around Dublin. This particular weapon was left off in the Gresham Hotel in 1920 to be collected by a female volunteer of the Cumann na mBan. And she would then smuggle this weapon around, hidden in a French dictionary, to a quartermaster's dump, or then carried over to an active service unit. So once the shooting was carried out, weapons like this were handed over to the Cumann na mBan volunteers very, very quickly. They weren't searched by the police or by the army. But by the middle of 1921, the police are actually starting to bring in female Castabri to actually carry out searches of women to break down that. So this is how weapons are then smuggled around. This particular one was dropped off the Gresham Hotel and for whatever reason was never collected and was eventually handed over to the National Museum of Ireland in the 1930s. Liam Lynch, only commander who ever took a military barracks during the War of Independence. Many RIC stations, of course, destroyed and attacked. He took over Mallow military barracks from the Lancers, captured the revolver that you see above, and also the flare gun that you see just here. Flare guns are very, very important during this period because the first thing that volunteers would do was to cut the telephone lines, and after that, especially at night, flares are what the RIC in their stations would have fired into the air to alert nearest town that they were in trouble, or also in the military barracks. This is a Luger revolver. Again, you find a kind of a fascination among the leading members of the War of Independence with German guns. There's almost a fetishism in their desire to have German guns. This is a long-barreled Luger carried by Sean Tracy. Was used by him to defend himself when he was ambushed by Lieutenant Price. That's Lieutenant Price there on Talbot Street in October 1920. This is one of the few action films that was to happen during the War of Independence when the aftermath of that shooting between Price and Sean Tracy was filmed by a Pathé newsreel. And you can see there that the bodies are being collected by a mixture of civilians who've been impressed into service to collect the bodies and British Army soldiers. The gentleman in the tall hat that you can see there is actually the parish priest from the local church. At that time, parish priests all wore tall hats, looking more like Victorian gentlemen than parish priests. In this situation, both gentlemen took out their guns at the same time and shot each other, and that's why they were both killed. But the reality, as Ernie O'Malley states in Raids and Rallies, the shotgun is probably the most effective weapon at night. In the darkness, the effectiveness of weapons change their values, and a shotgun with its unaimed and scattered fire was the most important weapon. So what you find in ambushes at night is that the shotgun men are always in near the roads, in the ditches, firing at police and also army patrols, while the volunteers with rifles maybe back 200 metres But again, rifles at night trying to fire at the enemy, quite ineffective because you can't see. There are no night vision scopes in these days. So warfare has now changed in the 21st century as more scopes are introduced. From Dublin, the GHQ, General Headquarters, tries to kind of control the War of Independence. Historians argue about its effectiveness. This is a dramatised drawing or painting painted in the 1950s of everyone in GHQ at the time. In many ways, they never met up as a GHQ because many of them were, of course, on the run. In the case of Michael Collins, they also had a very busy time running the Ministry for Finance at the time. But they did try to send out training memos and circulars to the volunteers around the country. In this case, how to use a revolver. As I said earlier on, casualties from revolvers quite high. And these were training notes. So you can start to see the structure of GHQ trying to control what the IRA are doing, but also trying to get the information out there, learning from ambushes. They're requiring commanders now to report back on ambushes and how successful they have been or haven't been, so lessons can be learned. And they're the things that armies and militaries around the world still do today, learn from their mistakes and try to improve. By November 1920, the IRA in Dublin had become a very sophisticated organisation. Again, not having enough weapons, but it had, during Bloody Sunday, the intelligence and the intelligence network to carry out a series of attacks on British Army officers, some of them officers of the British Army, others members of the Intelligence Corps, and quite successfully nullified the British intelligence system in Ireland. On the left-hand side, you see here a map of Donnybrook, and this is a map that was given to the gunmen who carried out an attack at 117 Moorhampton Road, which is just where the X is. And this is the route into the attack and also their escape route. So this shows pre-planning within the IRA at the time that the active service unit that went into this building knew exactly where they were going, who they were going to target, and more importantly, how they were going to get out as quickly as possible. It helped, of course, that the local police station had two constables in the Dublin Metropolitan Police, one a sergeant and a constable, who were actively helping the volunteers at the time. The police station was only about 500 metres away. But it does show you that the level of thought and planning that goes into operations like this at that time. There also is huge energy put in by the engineering part of the GHQ to create bombs and to make better and more efficient grenades. And the casting of grenades is not a problem. You can go to small foundries all over the country and make these. In this case, in County Cavan, the RIC station, by the way, is only 50 metres away from this particular foundry, which shows you maybe the police in Cavan were keeping their head down. But the big problem that the IRA had at the time was explosives and providing the explosives to go into the weapons. And most accounts that you will have read from the first primary books that came out in the 1930s and 40s, but also from the pension files, is grenades and bombs being set off were not actually exploding. And most ambushes start that way. So a huge amount of effort went into it, but as I say, it was the lack of having the techniques to make their own explosive was their undoing. And here are samples of those taken from military archives. The type of casings that were used, but as I say, no explosive to go with them. Just to break down, look at one particular ambush, and coming from Dublin, my kind of area, what I know, is an ambush at Rathmines on the 5th of February 1921, which occurred in the evening. A very large group of IRA moved from the top of Rathmines down with cycle scouts, and cycle scouts are sent out to find a British Army patrol or truck. And eventually they end up here in Rathmines Church, this is a very large building in the centre of Rathmines, which ironically had been burnt down by accident the previous year and was a wreck. And they hold up there waiting for a British Army patrol. And when the patrol arrived, they opened fire. There was 22 officers, NCOs and men in the IRA ambush unit. They had 15 revolvers, so there was no rifles. Having a rifle in Dublin is very, very difficult to smuggle around, so everyone has a revolver. 4 bombers, 2 cyclists who are carrying out the reconnaissance, and then 1 first aid, who you can actually see just back here. One lorry was attacked, wounding the officer who was sitting up front, and 2 civilians who were walking past the lorry in the wrong place at the wrong time became casualties. However, the troops in the back of the truck returned fire, and 4 IRA members become casualties. And then 1 is arrested, and I think this is quite an interesting from the after-action report. Through a form of stupidity that none could foresee, he's arrested. I'd love to know what actually happened to him. but it was one very angry officer commanding after that. But the revolvers used were 9.45 revolvers, which more than likely were captured RIC Webleys, 38s, and then 32s, which are fairly ineffective revolvers. These revolvers all have between 5 and 4 rounds of ammunition in them. So when you do fire them, you're looking at about 50 seconds of firing by the IRA unit onto the British Army truck before they started to run. And that's the reality for the IRA. You fire and you get out as quickly as possible. But in this resulting fire from the troops, 4 IRA casualties. In many ways, this kind of explains what's happening in 1921. Every time there's an attack by the IRA, they're losing 3 or 4 volunteers. More and more volunteers are being picked up off the street and put into prisoner of war camps. So you're starting to see about 3,000 to 4,000 IRA volunteers and innocent civilians in camps from the Curragh all the way over to Spike Island. And this is how the British Army were starting to break down the volunteers as 1921 went ahead. So these operations are successful, but the loss towards the IRA becomes higher and higher as 1921 goes on. In particular, the famous attack on the Custom House, when 70 IRA volunteers, and essentially the heart of the Dublin Brigade, is captured in one fell swoop during a failed operation. So when we're looking at smuggling of weapons, the first and most famous of smuggling of weapons is the Odd, which was smuggling in weapons to provide support to the 1916 rebels. Germans weren't going to send troops, but they were happy to send Russian rifles. Again, they didn't want to send their own rifles. German Mosers is what you'd normally be sent, but at that time they had their own problems fighting a war. So they had defeated the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, and that's what the Irish were going to get, was 20,000 Russian rifles, ammunition, and about 10 machine guns. They were going to be landed at Fennet Pier, which would, if they had landed, been quite a good place to land weapons. It had a very sophisticated rail yard, and it would have allowed the loading up of trains and the dispersal of the weapons around the country quite quickly. However, due to a variety of reasons, things didn't happen that way, and both the Odd and later on Roger Casement are captured on Good Friday, the 21st of April. In many ways, at that stage, the rebellion can never be successful. During the War of Independence, the main source was from Liverpool, smuggling of weapons on the various ferries and tramp ships coming from Liverpool to Dublin. Dublin port, as it is today, provides about 80% of all imports and exports into the country. And it was due to the work of the dockers, but in particular the staff of the port company, that these weapons were smuggled in. But at the same time, the number of weapons that were smuggled in and the amount of effort that went into smuggling these weapons was quite small. And this is a figure from the Richard McCahey papers. 289 handguns, 53 rifles. Again, rifles are quite big and bulky. And then ammunition is actually easier to smuggle in, well over 24,000 rounds of ammunition smuggled in. But again, for the amount of effort and hard work that went into it, a very small result. Michael Collins did attempt to organise weapons from Europe, but they all failed. Again, the British intelligence system was very much going around Europe and making sure that the IRA couldn't buy up weapons. He had better luck in America. This is what the port looked like in 1906. It became a very, very large part of the city with a large number of rail yards, all geared to taking the produce and the emigrants from Ireland and bring them down to the docks as quickly as possible. During the war, the North Wall is taken over by the Royal Navy, and they control everything that's coming in and out of the city. While on the South Quays, around the area of Sir Rogerson's Quay, the US Navy takes it over and turns it into their main warehouse. So all supplies coming in to look after the US Navy in Cork were first of all transshipped from Liverpool into Dublin, and then from there on the train system down to Cork, to the very large fleet that was down there. And these images taken in the 1920s kind of give you an idea of the scale and size of the port at this time. The port at the time had an IRA unit called Q Company. It reported directly to CHQ and to Michael Collins. It was led by Captain Kennedy, who was a labourer who worked for Dublin Port. And in many ways, this highlights the desperate need for weapons, that GHQ had a direct link to Q Company rather than Q Company providing weapons just to the Dublin Brigade. And this is to make sure that weapons weren't seeping into the local IRA units, but were actually going to GHQ and could be then sent around the country. At the same time, in Liverpool, you had a very large volunteer unit, 155 IRA volunteers in Liverpool who smuggled guns. They also carried out the burning of warehouses and buildings in 1920 and 21, which GHQ frowned upon. They were more interested in the smuggling operations than causing consternation to the citizens of Liverpool, and regularly wrote letters to the unit over there saying, stop it, we just want weapons. The British government response to all this was to set up in 1921 a specialised auxiliary unit in the port. Q Company of the Auxiliary Division of the RAC is established in March 1921 and are based here in the London and North Western Railway Hotel, which is still on the North Quays. The photograph, which is above from the National Library, shows an operation carried out by the Dublin Brigade against the building when a series of grenades were thrown into the officers' mess that the bar had been turned into. And you can see the auxiliaries outside celebrating their survival because the grenades didn't go off. What's interesting about this particular unit, they didn't consist mainly of British Army veterans. They would have been mainly Royal Navy veterans, Merchant Navy, and people who had experience in ports and in logistics in the war. And they were brought over to catch and try and break Q Company of GHQ in the port at this time. The kind of most successful operation, or probably the most, not necessarily successful, but probably the one that has caught the imagination, has been well written about, is the smuggling of Thompson machine guns into Ireland in 1921. 3 machine guns were sent over by these gentlemen here from the 69th Regiment, the very famous Irish-American unit in America, who brought over weapons to Collins to show them this new weapon that had been invented by Colonel Thompson. It was a very man-portable weapon that could be used, and everyone kind of felt that this was the way forward. Michael Collins then ordered 653 of the machine guns. So it was the first order that Thompson's got, and they were made by the Colt Company in Hartford, Connecticut. And they were to be sent to Ireland in June 1921. But British military intelligence got word of this, and working with the US authorities, had most of those weapons impounded, although about 150 of the weapons did get into Ireland by the end of 1921. And the dubious honour for the first use of the Thompson machine gun in action, and one that the Thompson Company were happy to celebrate and to use in PR campaigns in America, was in Drumcondra in June 1921, just prior to the truce. Oscar Traynor, later on a Minister for Defence, leading the attack, carried out an attack on trains on the railway track out of Drumcondra, wounding 3 soldiers and killing about 16 horses. They were a cavalry unit, but they shredded up all 2 carriages as they went by using the Thompson machine guns. And as I say, the company itself were very happy with this, because then they can go and advertise it as a weapon used in combat. And this is what a Thompson machine gun looks like. There's still a number of them around. Kilmainham Jail has them, the military archives and the army have them. It does look like the weapon that we associate with the gangsters in Chicago, but it had a 100-round drum. Wasn't a very easy weapon. Took a lot of training to learn how to use it, but very, very effective when used by Oscar Traynor in attacking the trains in June 1921. This rifle here, which is on display in the National Museum in Collins Barracks, is one of a consignment that was landed in Cork in 1920. Collins had tried to control all smuggling into Ireland. As I said, very much GHQ was trying to control it through Dublin. However, the Cork IRA had smuggled in weapons directly from America. But in this case, for some reason, they have cut off the butt of the rifle. And the story or the folklore associated with this is that they wanted to fit more of these rifles in the rowing boats that they had used to row out to a freighter. Somebody came up with the idea of cutting off the butts so they could put more weapons into the rowing boats. Naturally, a rifle without a butt is a bit like a car without an engine. It's very, very hard to use. So in the end, and in concluding, during the War of Independence, it's pistols like Peter the Painter here on the left-hand side, but in particular shotguns that carry out most of the shooting. There's very, very few long ambushes. Ambushes are very short, normally 2 to 3 minutes. And in the end, about 35 to 40% of all casualties during the War of Independence are carried out by the humble single-barrel shotgun, which can be found in most farms at the time. And the lack of weapons, as I say, was an ongoing concern to GHQ. And it's one of the things that was in Michael Collins' mind as they went towards the truce, that they were running out of volunteers who were being picked up, wounded or captured. And they were also running out of ammunition, and they didn't have enough weapons to carry out a sustained campaign through the rest of 1921. So in many ways, we're lucky that the truce did break out in the summer of 1921. As I say, with a high number of civilian deaths, we can only imagine what would have happened if the truce hadn't broken out. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening to me, and if you have any questions, delighted to answer it for you.